let's just go on. All right, this is one of those, if anything can go wrong, it will. So we're back with at least some of you, and we're trying to access other people. So welcome to the webinar in which we talk about Mennonite Brethren theological roots. What does it mean for us to be evangelical and Anabaptist? And I've got Tim Geddert next to me here. I think that we've got Aaron Halvorsen online working with us, and he'll be responding to what Tim has to say. I think without further ado, we're going to launch into this. We're going to record it so that if anybody misses the opening words, they'll be able to catch up later. Thank you so much. If you don't want to have your face seen, you might just turn off your your camera for the moment.
Am I starting?
Thank you, Tim.
All right.
Tim Geddert, professor at Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary and a member of the U.S. Board of Faith and Life. Thanks to the USMB conference for co-sponsoring this event.
All right. I join Lynn in apologizing for technical difficulties. We will do the best we can with what we've got. So thanks a lot for your patience. My assignment was to get a conversation started. Can you ask Patty to turn off her mic? Patty, your mic is... We're hearing...
My mic is not on.
Well, it's echoing somehow.
Can you take these things out of here? Okay, can you hear feedback, or does it sound okay? Everything sounds okay to you? All right, I see one thumbs up. I'm going to assume that everything is fine, and I'll get started. Again, our apologies, and I am glad to make this contribution, and I hope we have a great conversation afterwards. So I want to begin by talking about what it is that happened back in the Reformation that already from the start shaped the Anabaptist movement to be both what we now call Anabaptist and what we now call evangelical, even though some of those terms might have been anachronistic at the time that these movements were happening. So what happened in the Reformation that gave birth to the Anabaptist movement? Really, it was disciples of Jesus who took an alternative approach, an alternative response to the dominant groups in the Reformation. All three of the dominant groups, the Lutheran movement, the Calvinist movement from John Calvin, Zwinglian movement, in different ways with different emphases, ended up moving in the direction of still a state-sponsored form of the Christian church. So it was an alternative to Catholicism, but it wasn't fully an alternative in terms of the relationship between church and state. And that's where the Anabaptist movement took a different course. We do not align ourselves with the dominant power of the state. Christian faith is a voluntary choice to believe, to follow Jesus, and the logical step that went along with that then was what signaled the movement in some significant ways, and that was believers' baptism. Now, right from the start, not only the Anabaptists, but also most of the other reformers shared some of the features that we now associate with evangelicalism. Strong authority of Scripture. In fact, the authority of Scripture was Luther's major slogan. Not the church hierarchy, but the Scriptures become our final authority. It was a strong conviction of the substitutionary death of Jesus, of the victorious resurrection of Jesus, of the necessity for new birth, for conversion, faithful Christian living, including spiritual disciplines, mission, evangelism, resisting the powers of evil. So many of these emphases, some of them were shared with the rest of the reformers. All of them, I think, are thoroughly consistent with what we today call evangelicalism. It wasn't called it at the time. In fact, I think in some senses, the Anabaptist movement was the only alternative to the state form of the church back in the 16th century. Now, they also emphasized some things that contemporary evangelicals do not necessarily emphasize. In that category, I would even include believers' baptism. That might surprise most North American evangelicals to think that believers' baptism is not an evangelical distinctive. But if you've spent any time in Europe at all, you know that the majority of evangelicals in Britain, in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Spain, and almost everywhere else, the majority of evangelicals baptize infants. That's because the majority of the evangelicals are the evangelicals within the Anglican Church, the evangelicals within the Presbyterian Church, within the, all the churches in Europe. There are also other groups that, of course, practice believers' baptism. There's Baptists, Mennonites all over Europe. But for the most part, you can't claim that believers' baptism is an evangelical distinctive in Europe, although it tends to be closer to that in North America. So among the other emphases that the Anabaptists focused on already in the 16th century were over against worldly powers. And that's something that has often characterized the Anabaptist movement more strongly than most other movements that we now might call evangelical. That, among other things, included nonviolent response to enemies, avoiding professions where violent use of force was a necessary job component, for example, the military, sometimes the police force, etc. And then a strong focus on discipleship and community, holding people accountable. If you know your Mennonite history, you know that that often led to fairly aggressive forms of church discipline, and so on and so on. So Anabaptism in the 16th century was already very much like what we today call evangelicalism in certain respects, and somewhat unlike it in other respects. If that's how I characterize early Anabaptism, how do I characterize evangelicalism? Well, on the one hand, you could say it's a rather new movement, but another way of looking at it calls it a very old movement. So let me describe both of those ways of thinking about it. Contemporary evangelicalism, especially in North America, grows out of what was called fundamentalism in the first half of the 20th century. That, in turn, grew out of the split between modernists and fundamentalists at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Basically, the church split along the lines of, what we today call modernism and fundamentalism. Fundamentalism at the beginning, that is 150 years ago, did not necessarily mean narrow, rigid. It just meant holding on firmly to the fundamentals of the Christian faith. Through the first half of the 20th century, it became rather clear to people who were happy to call themselves fundamentalists that there is quite a broad spectrum of people also claiming that, and that the term itself didn't necessarily communicate openness to learn, openness to collaborate with people who don't see it exactly the same way. And so somewhere around the middle of the last century, the term evangelical came to be much more acceptable as, at least in part, an alternative to fundamentalism. Fundamentalism then characterized the most conservative, the most, perhaps you could say, rigid groups within that larger movement, whereas evangelicalism, somewhat more moderate. And that has led to one of the challenges of defining evangelicalism today, is where are the boundaries on both ends? Where does evangelicalism at its most conservative end become fundamentalist? And where does evangelicalism at its more progressive end cease to be evangelical? And I think that those of us who struggle with how to use these terms probably know that not everybody's going to agree on who falls within the camp of evangelicalism. So in the sense that I've just described, evangelicalism is a fairly recent movement. However, almost all evangelicals would say, well, but that's completely the wrong way to characterize it. Evangelicals are those who have recaptured what faithful believers have always believed. In other words, evangelicalism is 2,000 years old. It's what the early church believed. It's what the faithful minority throughout the centuries have believed. It's what Anabaptists and others in Reformation times have believed. In other words, contemporary evangelicalism is simply the way in which we now experience what faithful believers have always believed. So 2 ways to characterize it, and I think that each of them has its own particular strengths and weaknesses. Truth is, evangelicalism is a pretty broad spectrum of groups within the Christian church. and so on. So that's my attempt, at least, to say a little bit about what Anabaptism originally stood for, what evangelicalism today means. So how did these become components of the Mennonite Brethren Church? I think a fair reading of the history of the 19th century in Russia and Ukraine, where the MB movement began, would say that right from the start, a strong Anabaptist emphasis was born into the church, because it was a renewal movement within a larger Anabaptist Mennonite context. So Anabaptism was just assumed. At the same time, the influences within that renewal movement were much broader than that. There was a German pietist by the name of Wüst who had a significant influence on the birth of the MB Church. And so many of the components that we today would associate with evangelicalism became part of the renewal that happened within the Mennonite Church in Russia, and that led then to the birth of the MB Church as a separate movement within the larger movement. There are people who would say that there were really three strands at the origin of the MB Church. There was the pietist, conservative German Lutheran Wüst's influence. There was the Anabaptist influence, and then there was a somewhat of a charismatic influence. If you read the history books, they talk about what in German is called the fröhliche Richtung, the exuberant Mennonite Brethren. If you want my personal opinion about it, I don't think the early Anabaptists had a charismatic theology. I don't think they had a theology that corresponds to Pentecostalism. I think they were just really excited. You can take the most staunchly conservative, non-charismatic church you know of and send them to a football game that everybody's excited about, and they'll be dancing in the aisles and hugging and screaming and shouting, and they haven't become charismatics. They've just become really enthusiastic. And so I'm doubtful that there ever was a strong charismatic influence among the early Mennonite Brethren. However, it has in part entered into the Mennonite Brethren family of churches in the influences of the last 50 years in some places. So contemporary Mennonite Brethren belief and contemporary Mennonite Brethren practice continues to have components of Anabaptism from our heritage, many components of evangelicalism, simply because a lot of us believe that those emphases are the way the gospel is to be understood from the New Testament and practiced within the church. In some places, a stronger charismatic influence, simply because the influences of other denominations around us have also shaped us, and our readings of the New Testament sometimes include significant components of that. So what do we do with all this diversity? I think that one of the challenges is to think through how broad or how narrow we think the tent can be or should be. If we're going to be Anabaptist and evangelical, what do we mean? Do we mean we take the very best of both, sort of the most important features of evangelicalism and the most important features of Anabaptism, and create this new entity, which is this beautiful harmony of the best of both? If we try that, one of the dangers is we want to have one right answer that's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of something else. In practice, it very seldom works to pull in the boundaries really tight and say, this is exactly who we ought to be. And so an alternative would be exactly the opposite, and that is we have a much larger tent. We affirm evangelicalism, we affirm Anabaptism to some degree. MBs affirm aspects of a charismatic approach to ministry and faith. And so we have a very large tent that includes a lot of all of the above. Not that any one church practices them all, any one believer emphasizes them all, but we have a large tent that affirms the best of, or not only the best of everyone, but pretty much the whole breadth of everyone. So do we have a narrow tent that has our own unique way of combining the two? Do we have a broad tent that opens the doors wide for everybody in all these different directions? Or do we just fight about it? Say, I think everybody should be like I am, and I think everybody should be like I am. And then we look at the worst of each movement and we claim that it's the problem. And that, I fear, is what occasionally happens when we don't have the grace to recognize the the richness of various different traditions among us. So you probably want to know what I'm going to say about where I stand, or else you already have your own guesses as to where I stand. In my view, evangelicalism is very, very strong in the NB Church. I think that virtually every pastor, every preacher, every church would strongly affirm most of the main features of American evangelicalism. I think Anabaptism is not nearly as strong among us. I think in some ways we have vestiges of it in our ethos. I think that's how I would have experienced at our study conference in Phoenix recently. Not that we agree, but that we still feel like a family. We still feel like we belong somehow together. I think those are vestiges of a communal experience of Anabaptism. I think in some churches, in some places, there's a strong Anabaptist leaning, but I see that as much, much less strong than our sort of consensus around evangelicalism. So where do I stand? I would like to make sure that Anabaptism doesn't get lost in the mix. I firmly affirm the main features of evangelicalism, but let's not lose our Anabaptism in doing it. We can take the strengths of more than one movement and learn together and learn from each other. So that's my opening piece. I didn't watch the clock at all. I know we started a little bit late. I apologize for that again. But I want to turn the mic now over to Aaron Halvorsen, who's been requested to make the next contribution. Whether he agrees or disagrees, more than happy to see how he views our particular brand or mixture of evangelicalism and Anabaptism, and then perhaps I'll have a comment or two, maybe not, and it's a wide open conversation for everybody else involved. All right, so I'm not the technician here, but I hope that we can find a way to get Aaron on next. How do we do that? Is Aaron there?
Aaron is one of the people that may not have.
All right. Aaron is one of the people that apparently hasn't made it on. Again, we apologize. If you want to know what happened, somehow a wrong link was sent, and so not everybody was then aware that that was the problem, and therefore checking for the new link that was sent out. So again, we apologize. All right, in that case, if Aaron is not here, I'm going to invite some of my colleagues on the Board of Faith and Life, any one of them who might wish to make a comment in response to what I've said, maybe several of them. I know that a few of you are online, and hopefully one or two of you are ready to jump in with a few responses, and then we'll open up the conversation, including Aaron, if at some point we can get him online. Okay, who'd like to jump in? I see some names. I see Tim Sullivan. I see Don Morris, I see Jana Hildebrandt. Those are the only ones I see on my screen right now in terms of names.
If they would like to, if they click on the participant button, then there will be at the bottom of that a place for them to either click yes or raise their hand, and then I can unmute them.
Okay, I don't know if you could hear that voice in this room, but if you want to join the conversation, you click on the participant list. Is that correct, Patty?
Yes. And,
okay.
And either click the yes button or
and then
raise your hand.
Raise your hand or click the yes button. So anyone who would like to do that, encourage you to jump in with this, with your response to what I've shared so far. Okay, I see Dave now as well. I'm just picking the names that I see on my screen who are also on the Board of Faith and Life. Anybody? I hope you're able to do it. Click on the participant list by your name, raise your hand, or click yes. And then the host technician here will beam you in. Anybody?
I have one here, Don Morris.
All right, Don Morris, I believe you are being piped in. Thank you very much for helping us out here.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay?
I can't see you on my screen, but I can hear you.
Okay. Well, basically, Tim, I have a question, and maybe to help to clarify, because I think that some would wonder how has Reformed theology entered into the mix of these two things, of the Anabaptist and evangelical? And is that a topic for today, or is that something we want to wait for later?
I think it's appropriate to broach it today, although I want to alert us all to the fact that that's next week's conversation. Next week, we're going to do a webinar, and hopefully, without glitches, that has two of us sort of as presenters here, myself and Dave Thiessen. And we're going to be talking about the attractiveness and the features of, and maybe the diverse reactions to the neo-Calvinist, neo-Reformed influence in the conference these days. But I think it's appropriate already to make some comments. I was taught 40 years ago, when I was in Bible college, that in general, Anabaptists were not Calvinists. They were more Arminian, if you think of the spectrum between Arminian and Calvin. But at the same time, I don't think that Anabaptists or their confessions of faith ever really took a stand one way or the other on that question. Contemporary Anabaptists will often claim that we lean more away from Calvinism than towards it. We're more Arminian than we are Calvinist. Those of you who've sat in my classes know I don't like to claim either term particularly, but in any case, more Arminian. So the influence of the neo-Calvinists within our denomination, which is quite strong, has not come from our Anabaptist heritage. It's come via our evangelical associations across North America. It's much stronger in North America. That is, in North America than it would be, for example, in Europe and other places. It's quite strong. It's been the fastest growing theological movement within the Evangelical Theological Society for the last 20 or 30 years. 30 years ago, Evangelical Theological Society was, I think, a balanced mixture across the spectrum of what we now would call Calvinist and Arminian, Pentecostal, Anabaptist, and more it's become a movement that is defined by its Calvinist understandings. So what are the reasons for that? It's the larger ethos of the evangelical church. It's pastors who have joined the MB conference who were trained in schools where that's being taught. But we're going to explore that in more detail next week. So I don't know if that's sufficient for starters. But I do see Aaron and I apologize that we created difficulty for lots of people getting on. You didn't get a chance to hear me this morning, but you did get a chance to read what I was going to say in my opening volley. So I am interested in whatever you'd like to say in response. So thanks, Aaron.
Well, yeah, hearing your introduction to next week's webinar, I almost feel like I should be involved on that one too, because
sure.
I don't come from a Mennonite Brethren background. I come from a larger evangelical background, grew up with going to a Presbyterian church, Baptist church, Foursquare church, multiple different denominations, but all characterized by evangelicalism. So I grew up in evangelicalism and trained in evangelical school at the Western Seminary, and kind of joined up with the Mennonite Brethren since then. So I think when I hear Tim, or at least what I saw in your notes, is us wanting to maybe lean into the Anabaptist heritage a little bit. I'm actually in agreement with that, just because with you, I recognize that it's hard to define what is evangelicalism, what are the boundaries, what does it even mean? Depends on who you talk to and in what context. So I would love to see us lean into Anabaptism or that heritage just for the sake of theological, biblical, convictional clarity. What do we mean when we say who we are? And with that, because I didn't grow up in with an Anabaptist heritage, there are some things about the heritage I truly, truly love. There are other things I have a lot of questions about or concerns about even. So I'm not sure where I stand with it and what I would want to lean into and what I wouldn't want to lean into. I recognize that a lot of the things I love about the Anabaptist heritage, and from what I understand of the Anabaptist heritage, I picked up in the evangelical churches. So a strong sense of being born again and discipleship under Jesus, I think I picked up from a Reformed charismatic pastor while I was in college. a sense of wanting to reconcile and peacemaking. I picked up from Ken Sande and Alfred Poyer, who, Presbyterian, I think, background. So I think I picked up a lot of Anabaptist things from broader evangelicalism.
Right.
And some of those I'd love to lean into more. I think what I see in my own church, and cut me off if I'm going along here, but for what I see in my own church is I think I see a broader evangelicalism in my own church. I don't know if I see a rich heritage of Anabaptist theology. I do see some vestiges of Anabaptist culture, maybe some of it at times a watered down version of it, where I would love us to have more robust Anabaptist understanding. So I think a case in point for that is we have a general ethos of peacemaking, which has kind of become a watered down pacifism or even passive aggressive culture in our own church, where we've kind of forgotten the proactive gospel reconciliation part, which is really the heart of it. But it's become kind of a watered down, let's just get along, which I don't think is the heart of it. So, so that's a smattering of my own thoughts of where I come from and how I see this.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful, and we'll give you a chance to comment more often if people want to pose questions to you or whatever. If you want to speak, and if you have your video on, you can also just raise your hand so we can visibly see your hand, and then we can call on you that way. Apparently, not everybody's clear on how exactly to get in, but
I think there's also a raise hand feature.
there's also a raised hand feature if you click on beside your name on the participant list. All right, that's another way, and then we can call you in. All right, I'm going to still leave the offer open if anyone else, for example, on the Board of Faith and Life, wants to jump in with a comment or two, and then we're going to very soon just turn to questions from anyone who has them or comments.
Lost video.
Tim, you are muted. Tim, you are muted and we can't hear you talking.
Okay, now I'm not unmuted. I apologize. Somehow this isn't doing what we thought it would. Okay, I see Dave, and I see that he's unmuted. I'd be happy to have you join in, Dave. Is that?
Okay.
Thank you.
I was wondering, I know that in our history we've been confessional, starting with the Schleitheim, I think. Is that right? The Schleitheim Confession?
Yep.
If someone could comment on the difference between being confessional versus being creedal, would that be helpful? Talk about Anabaptists in that light, or is that another whole can of worms?
Yeah, they're all cans of worms, and some of them are worth exploring a little bit. We sometimes use the word confessional as the alternative to creedal, and the truth is creeds also have a range. Some churches are founded by a creed. Whoever signs to this creed is in, and whoever doesn't is out. Technically, the Augsburg Confession is the creed. It's the founding document for a very large number of churches. And when I'm in Europe, people say it can't be changed. I mean, you would be disbanding the church if it was ever changed, because it's the Constitution, and there isn't even you can't even amend a constitution of that kind. So that's an approach that is not usually the case. People don't have that kind of strict founding documents, but confessional churches tend to prescribe what must be believed. And we sometimes use the word confession as the alternative to prescription, but it's certainly more than just description. It falls somewhere between the two. And I think MB have often conversed about, do we think of it as prescriptive or do we think of it as descriptive? I think it has pieces of both. It does describe what we currently confess together, but to the extent to which we make it a communal confession, you can't just say, well, I'm just going to take and leave any part of it that I feel like. Respect for all of it is expected. Agreement with most of it is assumed. Otherwise, we wouldn't be calling this a communal document or a communal confession. And yet, to believe every line, to teach every line, we're going to have different degrees of enthusiasm for certain parts of it. We know that that happened over a very long period of time with Article 13. We now have a form of it that doesn't say what everyone wishes it would say, but at least it says what most people can actually also believe. And so we do change as we feel the need to clarify, or where convictions actually do change over time. So it falls somewhere between prescriptive and descriptive. I think because of that, we should keep calling it a confession rather than a creed. Creed almost implies that this is the must set of beliefs, and in some cases for all time. Those would be some of my thoughts on that. By the way, the Canadian Mennonite Brethren are in the process of confessional revision as well, and they're intending to do it different than what we did. We revised one in the light of perceived need to do so. They're planning to revise all of them on a rotating basis, so there never will be a stable confession anymore. These next 2 years, Article 8 will be revised, and then they'll perceive the next most important one to revise, and then the next, and it just keeps rotating around. That's the present intention, so that the Confession of Faith remains an ever-living document that keeps on saying what each generation wants to say about those things. So again, another approach, which is even more obviously non-creedal.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's open it up. Anyone who wants to comment or pose questions.
Tim, I'm not able to unmute Tim Sullivan. He's got his hand raised. There we go.
Tim,
Go ahead,
apparently
Tim.
your hand is up. There we go. You're unmuted.
Tim, in your opening remarks, you talked a little bit about we have vestiges of Anabaptism that still kind of course through our collective family's veins. And you referenced the study conference as one of those where we still gather together in a communal kind of atmosphere and assert that we're family and that we belong together. And, you know, we might have differing opinions about how strongly that was felt at the study conference. But I'm wondering, one of the questions that I think we've all had, and I've had over the years, is how do we maintain our Anabaptist distinctives in a culture that is increasingly connected, but also increasingly individualistic and in some respects isolated? I had a conversation with a pastor in one of our churches yesterday who talked about simultaneously being a part of the family, but potentially feeling a need to withdraw if certain things happened or didn't happen. And so there's, it seems to me that our culture increasingly pushes us to be less family, less connected, less committed maybe, and yet we have all these ways of being connected. I mean, even today, you look at who all's here and how we connect, and that's pretty amazing. So I'd be interested in your comment, and then Aaron's as well, just reflecting on that. Aaron's pastor of one of the churches in our U.S. conference that is a strong participant, anyway, I'd just be interested.
So one way I would answer the question is that I think a typical difference between average evangelicalism and average Anabaptism is on what do we believe is the function of the church. I think that for many people, the church is designed to be the best possible help to individuals. God's plan is for lots of individuals to be saved, and the church, at its best, helps those individuals. In other words, it's all about the individual. We want to save more individuals. We want to help individuals move towards greater maturity. We want individuals to have their pastoral needs met. And so we design the kind of church where each individual's needs are met in the best possible way. That's kind of how we think about church. If that's the primary way of thinking about it, why wouldn't it be obvious that you should just change churches whenever your needs can be met better somewhere else? Because every church is trying to meet your needs, and let's go find the one that succeeds. And so you shop for the church that meets your needs best. What if it's flipped around? What if God saves people for the sake of the building up of the corporate people of God to be a witness and a missional engagement in the world? In other words, don't ask what your church can do for you. Ask how you can participate in your church as part of God's mission. If that's the way, then there's a lot more reason to say, hanging in there with each other in good and hard times and being committed even when we disagree. Well, I mean, that's what families do. And so as a family, each church being a family, our whole family of MB churches in the U.S. being a family, we're committed to hanging in there and being a witness to the fact that God's grace is sufficient to hold us together when we disagree, to make even our struggling with our disagreements part of our witness to the world. We want to learn how to do it better than takes place in the halls of power in this country, et cetera, et cetera. So an Anabaptist emphasis will more strongly focus on the corporate, and that's why the idea of communal reading of Scripture and discerning together how we are not then to live, discerning together what to do about the fact that we don't agree on what it says. That's more of an Anabaptist emphasis. I've been to study conferences in other denominations where there are two sides, each vying for the greatest influence, and then at the end of the conference there's a vote, like who won, who lost. That sounds like a way of doing it that doesn't feel Anabaptist to me. It doesn't feel like the way we want to do it. Those would be some of my thoughts. I think you're right on that the individualism of our world is a major, major factor in pushing us either away from or towards some of these emphases within the church. Aaron, what do you think about that?
Well, I think I'd say yes and amen to everything you said. I think the irony for me is I think I came into the Mennonite Brethren Church with a little bit of that ethos and that heart, but that was built into me from what I learned from Reformed Baptist brothers. So it's kind of, again, it keeps becoming, and I don't know, I haven't been in leadership in that world, so I don't know exactly what that looks like practically, but I think at least in theory, I got that from reading people like Mark Dever or Michael Lawrence, or interacting with others in different parts of evangelicalism. So I carry that in theory with me into the Mennonite world, and I'm seeing it worked out like in the conference a couple weeks ago. So I think, so that's where my heart sings a little bit, because I think I'm seeing it work out but I got the conviction from broader evangelicalism.
Sure.
So I don't know if those things are necessarily intentionally, I have limited experience, but I think I'm saying yes and amen, and I like the way I see it worked out within our Mennonite Brethren denomination. I know I see things a little bit differently from others within the denomination, but it is my heart. I want to maintain unity and peace wherever possible, and I think that's done through open conversation like we've had.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks.
And I think, then following from that, you let people, you can't force anybody to stay around. So you put all your cards on the table, pursue unity with one another. And if you're with us, then please keep going with us.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. By the way, just a point of trivia, I can see almost everybody's names when I look on my screen, but when I look at my face, I see a different name. I see Lynn Jost's name. So in case you see that on your screen, and in case you don't know that my name is Tim Geddert, and beside me is Lynn Jost, whose computer I'm using. So, all right, who's next?
Let me lean into my computer and just point out to you, remind you that in the chat feature, there are 3 links, each with what we think are some helpful insights for understanding both Anabaptism and Scripture. We encourage you to take a look at those if you're looking for some written material, particularly Palmer Becker's "What is an Anabaptist Christian" is available in a PDF form online, so you could download it immediately, print it, hand it out. You can also purchase a printed version in a nice booklet form for a couple of dollars. Wherever you see "From Patty Patrick to Everyone," those are links that are available. Also, I know I'm just agreeing with Aaron and Tim here, but I think Aaron is making a great point that often Anabaptism agrees with lots of other Christians, and lots of other Christians have come up with some of the same things that we call distinctives and may have done so independently. In some cases, it may have been Anabaptists that found it first. For example, religious liberty, that is, can people live in a country without being killed for their faith, seems to have grown out of the radical Anabaptist movement, because until then, you couldn't. There were lots of Anabaptists killed, and Calvinists tended to kill Catholics and vice versa. So that's an example of such a thing. I also like what some of my Tabor College colleagues did, and we've tried to pick it up at the seminary as well, to say, what are some of the most important things about our faith, and how does both our evangelical heritage and our Anabaptist heritage point to those? So Tim's already done that in talking about church and authority. We get from evangelicalism faith of Scripture alone. It is the Scripture that is our authority. And from Anabaptism, we say, that's right, and it's the Scripture as we interpret in community. The same might be said of conversion and discipleship. Without the strong evangelical emphasis, you must be born again, we might tend to overdo the Anabaptist side of following Jesus day by day, though in its best form, both Anabaptism and evangelicalism understand that. Regarding discipleship, I've gotten lots of help from more evangelical sources about individual commitment to Christ, Bible memory, daily devotions, the personal dimensions. And from Anabaptism, I've been reminded that super individual Christians don't exist. Only Christians that are warmed in the cauldron of the body. With mission. Mission is all about reconciling people to God. And Anabaptists remind us that that reconciliation doesn't stop in the relationship between a human and God, but lots of reconciling happens more broadly. So those are examples of how there's not tension between Anabaptism and evangelicalism. There's a strengthening for us to have both heritages supporting us. Okay, Brian Harris has a question, and I'm going to turn it over to Tim to start the answer. My question is, how stretched can we be and still function? Seems like we're pretty stretched already, and stretch the tent too far and it's just going to rip apart or topple over.
Okay, yeah, before I say anything about that, let me comment on the chat function in case you're watching the chat. A very good explanation by Rob Thiessen from Canada, saying that I oversimplified or overclaimed what the Canadians were doing. So very much, Rob, that you said it from your perspective on the Board of Faith and Life in Canada. And so if you want to check the chat, basically it's not the case that the Canadians have committed themselves to this non-stop revision, but that they are going to be looking carefully at the different articles, etc. So read Rob's response in the chat, that would be great. And several people responded to that as well. Feel free to write your questions into the chat. I'll try to keep track of them. So Brian Harris's comment, yeah, a lot of us feel like the tent is being pretty stretched. The question is, what makes a tent stand up when it's pretty big? Well, we're going to probably need stronger poles that we can all lean on. Maybe if we could find some of the really, really important core convictions that matter to all of us and build strongly on those, then we would be less threatened by the differences on some of the other issues. But the reality is we're going to have a hard time agreeing on who's stretching the tent too far in which direction. Some people's view is that our Anabaptist associations are bringing influences into our MB conference that are just beyond what other people in the conference think is appropriate for us as an evangelical Anabaptist group. And there's some people who feel exactly the opposite, that our links to a larger evangelical movement are dragging us in directions that have not been consistent with traditional Anabaptism. So, yeah, I suppose we have a fairly big tent. I fear that it's not so much we have a big tent as we have a whole campground of different tents that are not necessarily always part of one big tent. And so we have, and I don't just mean individual churches that are individualistic. I actually believe that a church should be pretty individualistic. That is to say, learning from many others, collaborating with many others, and yet freed to practice dearly held convictions and to pursue the mission that's most effective in their context. So the autonomy of the local church, which is one of the things we at least cautiously say we believe in, is something that I actually believe in fairly strongly. So what is then the tent? And I think the tent becomes our shared convictions and shared projects and a support system that supports the local church. And so we keep working at that as a larger family of churches. We have a pretty big tent. I think all our district ministers would say it's one of the big challenges. How do we keep together in some sort of collaborative, mutually supportive unity, churches that are so diverse, and then perhaps even between districts, quite recognizable diversity as well. So Brian, you ask a really good question. How far can it stretch? And I don't know. Some people might say it's already toppling over. I think we keep working at strengthening the posts and keeping it.
You've been very, very patient with us, and we appreciate you sticking with us. We got a late start, and we're going to stay here for the next 10 or 15 minutes. Of course, some of you will have to bow out, and we understand that. And we want to give time for everybody who wants to get either a comment, maybe you want to correct something we've said, a different perspective, or if you have additional questions. So I see one from Jana, and I'll let Tim respond to that one.
Jana, could you comment on how current politics has impacted what we think evangelical means? Yeah, this is a little bit of a can of worms as well. There are people who have always called themselves evangelical who are a little less enthusiastic about the label these days because of what they or perhaps the media say about evangelicals. Evangelicals have been portrayed in the media, at least, as fairly uncritical supporters of a particular political direction in the country. And I think the reality is that most evangelicals probably lean more right than left politically, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're enthusiastic about the way the right practices politics, but they still lean that direction. And so then the media portrays them as uncritical supporters of everything on the right end of the spectrum. And that makes quite a few evangelicals and a very large number of Anabaptists very nervous. Is that really what we want our Christian faith to be perceived to be aligned with? So it's a question of, do we really believe the politics on the right? Do we really endorse the way politics is being practiced? And that would be true on the left or the right. Do we want to associate that with the word evangelical? And so there are people, but I think that the terrible mistake would be to say, let's throw away evangelical distinctives because of the fact that the label is getting some bad press. We might be nervous about the effect of touting the label, but that shouldn't in any way, in fact, it should do the opposite. It should send us back to careful reflection on what we really believe strongly as Christians, as evangelicals, as Anabaptists, and so on. So we don't change our convictions because somebody is besmirched or the label that we've been called by. Now, other people are responding saying, wait a minute, just because the label is sometimes getting some bad press in some places in one country doesn't in any way warrant getting rid of a label that's widely recognized across decades and across the world as a particular way of configuring our beliefs about Jesus. And so I have a few documents with me that I brought with me. I think Tabor College did a nice job of creating a core statement of identity. And they list, and this is available on their website if you like, We embrace the term evangelical for the following reasons, and then give a nice set of reasons. One is the literal meaning of the term. I mean, it means gospel. It means good news. That's the word evangelion in the New Testament. It's inclusiveness. Not everybody is associating that word with it these days, but that's what it has meant over decades. It's the inclusiveness of a very wide range of Christian groups. It's global acceptance. It's affirmation in our constituency. It's the transforming power that it represents. It's compatibility with our mission statements. So there's lots of reasons to continue to call ourselves evangelical, even though there are some disturbing associations that our cultures sometimes attaching to the word. That would be my response.
Does Tim Sullivan have a raised hand?
Tim, you have a raised hand? All right, let's see if we can get you in. Either can you unmute yourself, or there we go.
I appreciated that Patty had posted those links to those documents, and also wanted to just draw our attention to what's on our USMB website, which also has some descriptions of evangelical and Anabaptist and who we are both historically and theologically. So www.usmb.org, and if you look there, there's a menu, USMB Family, or a tab, USMB Family takes you to a menu called Who We Are, and there are a number of articles and documents that are helpful there as well.
Right, and the one that I've been looking at now is called What We Believe, and then it starts with our understanding of God comes from the Bible, in case you're wondering which one we're looking at. It talks a lot about our biblical foundations, and then it talks about although their current meanings overlap to some degree, what follows is a summary of what we have taken from each tradition, both evangelical and Anabaptist, and then several paragraphs that describe the values that we draw from evangelicalism and from Anabaptism. Okay, if somebody wants to talk, that'd be great, because I'm going to be reading some chat information now to try and keep up with the conversation.
Hey,
Aaron.
I have a question, just kind of as a test case for myself. So as I read through Becker's statement, one of the things I did not know about Anabaptism, Mennonite Brethren, as I was coming into the family a little bit, was the hermeneutic of viewing kind of all of Scripture through the lens of the Sermon on the Mount, and when Jesus speaks, and kind of that type of Christ-centered hermeneutic of seeing the New Testament through the lens of Sermon on the Mount, and so that hermeneutic was new to me. I still don't think I buy it, so I'm going to out myself. Where that's something that kind of I feel some tension for myself. So one of the questions I have is, how much can I be part of the camp, and am I the one who's stretching the tent legs or the tent pegs out too far? I want to be part of. I love my Mennonite brethren kind of new family, but I don't want to be the one who's expanding it out too far. So just as a test case, I bring that up of kind of for myself of where do I fit in this, even though that seems to be a distinct Anabaptist thing that I don't think I jive with, even though there's other parts of the Anabaptist heritage that I really do. So it's kind of a question for myself, and other people might feel similar things about other distinctives. I don't know if that makes sense in the way I'm putting that out.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, in the chat, there's a bunch of important contributions. Again, I encourage you to take a look at them. One of the blessings of the internet method of meeting like this is that we can bring people together from around the world. And so one of the comments has to do with precisely that. How does the global Mennonite Brethren Church speak into some of these questions? And I'm not going to claim to be an expert on how that happens, but I was very happy at the study conference that some of us attended in Phoenix that we did have representation from Canada, from Mennonite World Conference, from the ICOM, International Community of Mennonite Brethren. And indeed, we would do well to listen well to our brothers and sisters around the world. They have larger conferences than we do. They have broad experience in unique and diverse cultural contexts as well. And we can become too easily convinced that the truth is from our perspective. And so, yeah, and beyond that, I'm not sure what to say.
Kim, I'm going to risk interrupting. I think you've also raised questions about whether this lens idea of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount is the right way to describe that. Am I right about that, or Do you buy into that thing?
I guess not everybody would be aware of that part of the conversation, but
Okay,
yeah.
maybe that's a different conversation.
No, I'll refer to it though. On our USMB website, we try very briefly to, in a brief statement, to say how do we actually read the Bible, and we centralize Jesus. We read the Bible through the lens of Jesus. Jesus is the one who helps us know what to do with the Old Testament, and so there's one line in there that says, so we read the Old Testament with the lens of the New, we read the New Testament with the lens of the Gospels, and we read the Gospels with the lens of the Sermon on the Mount. That last part is the part that I personally challenge. I don't see any basis within Scripture for taking 3 chapters. Usually people actually only mean 1. They mean Matthew 5, as if this is somehow the lens through which we read all 4 Gospels. Now, you might say, well, that's because I want the lens to be in Mark, because that's my favorite book, and if it wasn't, then Luke would be, and so maybe that influences me. But I just find no basis whatsoever for taking 1 chapter or 3 chapters and saying this is the lens through which we read the Gospels. I want to learn everything I can from Matthew 5, but I also want to learn everything I can from every other chapter in the Gospels. And I might even be nervous about saying we read the New Testament through the lens of the Gospels.
Yeah.
I would rather say we read the New Testament through the lens of Jesus. How are we going to learn about Jesus? Well, we're going to learn a lot more about Jesus' life and ministry and death and resurrection from the Gospels than anywhere else. And so, but we're also going to learn about Jesus from Paul. And so I think Jesus is my hermeneutical center as an Anabaptist. That doesn't pit Bible against Bible. It helps us see what lenses tell us what to do with other parts of it. All right.
Tim, there was a question earlier that came through on private chat that I wanted to bring in because it may be appropriate here about, and maybe it's something you want to, this question says, might not be pertinent here, but this person has heard you speak about the difference between a biblical theology and a systematic one, and wondering whether or not that might impact the conversation. Confessional versus creedal.
All right. So perhaps you heard that in the back of this room, but people have heard me talk about the difference between biblical and systematic theology. In very short space here, I have to keep my answer exceedingly short, so please allow it to be not nearly nuanced enough. The very short answer is that I think there are very good forms of biblical theology, and I think there are very good forms of systematic theology. And at their best, the two are pretty closely the same thing. At their worst, however, they're very different. And so I personally am more nervous about the kinds of things that can go wrong with some forms of systematic theology than I am with biblical theology. And that's why I have a pretty strong preference. But I think that'll be much more relevant to next week's conversation with where one of the currently very widely espoused systematic theologies, and I think that's the correct term for it, Neo-Calvinism would claim to be a particular way of systematizing Christian faith. And so part of my response to Neo-Calvinism is not that it's needs to be critiqued or questioned in certain details, but that it's a particular way of doing theology, which I think needs to be at least seriously considered. How does it lead us towards the scriptural teaching, but how does it also run the risk of leading us away from it by being a system, not because it believes A or B or C, but because it overly systematizes. So that I favor biblical theology, but we need a lot more time to nuance exactly what I mean by either of those terms and why exactly I favor the one over the other. At the same time, fully admitting that all theologians are aiming to be biblical and all theologians are inevitably systematizing. It's not doing thinking without some systematizing, and it's not doing it Christianly without being biblical. So in one sense, the two can't be pitted against each other, but the way they're actually practiced, there are still significant differences.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's a great segue to next week. And trust us, we will have figured out how to send the right link to you by then. So sorry about how that worked out today. And Aaron, special thanks to you for the extra effort you made to get on and your very fine comments to us. We really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. One of the things I love about us and our heritage is being able to do things like this. So.
Amen. That's good.
And Tim, my colleague here beside me, thank you so much for your part. We really appreciate the succinct way in which you clarify things for us, and thank you for articulating that so well. Next week, same time, we will have Dave Thiessen from Mountain View Community Church, Mennonite Brethren, joining us. And it'll be pretty much the same format. We'll start at 8:30. By about 10:30, we will have done our major work. Sorry, not 10:30, 9:30, within an hour, 8:30 Pacific time, 10:30 Central time. We'll be on for about an hour. And then today I'm going to extend the conversation so that we're not going to just turn off our Zoom. We're going to say amen to this session, but if there's anybody that has a lingering question or a comment that you just didn't get a chance to do, please feel free to stay on. We will have the recording of this available. Tim Sullivan, where will people be able to get that? Where did we put it last time?
I'm sorry, ask the question again, Lynn.
The link to the recording.
My understanding is that this would be on the USMB Facebook page. There's a USMB leadership page, but the USMB Facebook page is different. I think that's where that will be posted. JL Martin probably would be
24 hours
equipped to answer that than me.
We will do our best to have it ready in 24 hours, maybe sooner. But as soon as we can get the technical work done, we will have the recording available. All right. Thanks again. And again, you're welcome to stay around if you've got a few more comments to make or if you have a specific question for somebody. But officially, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your patience and appreciate it so much. It looks like Lori has already told us where the recording is going to be available. So thank you.
All right.
Now, if you're sticking around, it seems like you might have an additional comment to make. So please just break in and get started. We'll see if we get 3 people talking at the same time.
If you raise your hand, you'll get unmuted. Otherwise, I think you can find a way to do it yourself.
I can unmute all.
Tim,
Yes.
this goes back to your kind of the latter part of our discussion here regarding the issue of the lens through which we interpret Scripture. And I know that you had raised that question with the U.S. Board of Faith and Life a little bit, and whether or not that was an accurate description. The description that's actually on the website, whether that accurately describes. And can you talk just a little bit about, so we started a little bit of a process. It's not quite completed at this point, but maybe describe a little bit how that conversation has unfolded and
Sure.
where it might go.
Sure. So actually it was in preparation for this morning that I pulled out this piece from our website called What We Believe. Read through it, took some notes, and then I was reminded of this line that I've seen before, but I hadn't been thinking about it, claiming that we read the Gospels through the lens of the Sermon on the Mount. And USMB Board of Faith and Life has been sending emails all over the place trying to deal with other issues, and I thought, we might need some relief. And so I sent an email and said, on a completely different topic, what do we think of this sentence? And so that started a new conversation, which I appreciate. I enjoy that a lot. But so I think wisely, our chair proposed, we shouldn't just as a board say, oh, yeah, let's just get rid of that line. Let's ask around a little bit. And so one of the places we asked was some of the Bible and ministry professors at the seminary, at the 2 colleges, and got some people saying, sure, go ahead, take out the line that doesn't seem quite right to some of you. Other people said, well, but it actually does capture a really important feature of what we believe as Anabaptists. It's not so much that we need one chapter to be the lens for all the other chapters, but Jesus does in Matthew 5, perhaps more clearly than anywhere else, take a stance in relation to the Old Testament and in relation to the way the Old Testament was being interpreted. So you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And so if we're going to look for any chapter at all that says, okay, this is the lens through which we understand Jesus' approach to the kingdom, to the Old Testament, to the way the Old Testament was being interpreted, you might not find a much better one or a more focused one than the Sermon on the Mount, in particular Matthew chapter 5. So it may or may not be the lens through which we read the Gospels, but it still might be worth paying pretty close attention to if we want to know what Jesus really does with both the traditions that he interacted with and his own self-awareness as being the fulfillment of the Old Testament and the covenant. So it's an ongoing discussion whether we'll ever get that line put in or taken out of one page of one website is probably not nearly as important as that we have good conversations about this. We think this through. But on the other hand, if we can say it in ways that help you in your conversations in your local church, that's a good thing. In that conversation, the most delightful thing to my ears was that people were saying, well, when we use this piece in our church, I say, ooh, I didn't even know people were using it. That's a good thing. Yeah, so. Is that what you wanted me to comment on, Tim? Yeah. All right, a lot of you are hanging around for a little longer, so jump in if you have comments. Okay, all the names are now on one screen, so we're down to that many. Anybody? Let's give 1 or 2 more minutes. If anyone wants to jump in, your last chance, then otherwise we'll just sign off and say, see many of you next week. Last chance? We're good? Don?
Yeah, Tim, just one last thing, maybe. You talked a little bit about maybe a 2-tiered, or I don't know if that's the way to describe it, confession of faith, or at least some of the articles of our confession that may take a higher, be elevated a little higher as far as saying these are non-negotiable. The others maybe have a broader tint. There's been quite a bit of discussion about that over the last year or two. And I guess I'd like to just maybe open it up a little bit. Others, how they would feel about something like that. Not that that's where we're going, but is that something that we feel like might be helpful to us to have, those confessions that we would all say non-negotiable, and others that we would say there's a little bit broader tint here? I don't know if that makes sense.
I don't know whose comment you want to hear. I mean, I think that it would be a challenging conversation to have us agree or disagree on which are the essentials and which are the less essential. I fear that, I remember the line that C.S. Lewis so graphically said, and of course I can't reproduce his language without quoting exactly, but he said, every Christian agrees that we should agree on the essentials and it's okay to disagree on the non-essentials. We all agree. We just don't agree on what the essentials are. And try to figure that out is a really big can of worms.
Right.
My own personal sense is that we've done a better job with the current version of the Confession of Faith, the last revision 20 years ago, than any previous Confession of Faith at making it genuinely a confession of faith. previous ones and many denominations' confessions of faith is a very big mixture of, first of all, what we agree with all Christians about. There is a God, and there is the Son of God who died and rose again. And like, nobody's going to disagree with it. So you could say, why do we have to bother putting it in? Well, we put it in because this is what we really believe, but so does everybody else. There's nothing distinctive. Well, if our entire confession of faith had nothing distinctive, we also wouldn't need it. So every confession of faith then ends up becoming this mixture. It's like, what do we agree with all other Christians about? Where do we agree with all other evangelicals? Where do we agree with all other Anabaptist evangelicals? Where do we agree with just the USMB? Like, it kind of devolves into, first of all, our joint values and then our distinctives. And confessions of faith tend to do, like, earlier versions of our confession of faith talked about what we do or don't believe about foot washing and things like that, because we have to distinguish ourselves from some other group. And I think our current confession of faith really genuinely has 18 articles that are all confessional statements. Now, it might still be that we don't agree quite on all of them, but at least we don't have nearly as wide a range of goals for our confession of faith. You know, core values, what we hold in common with everyone, what we hold in common with only these people, what makes us completely unique. That previous confessions did some of that, and this one I think doesn't. So this one is less suitable to have two tiers than any previous one has ever been, in my view. But it doesn't mean the problem couldn't be solved that way. Our disunity could be solved by a two-tier confession.
Maybe we need to talk about what's essential and what's not. Maybe we need to talk about what's more central and what's more peripheral, because all of them are really essential. Otherwise, we wouldn't have put them in there.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody at some time in history thought they were essential to say. So maybe to reframe our question, should we think about what's more central? What are those points where we really rally around?
Yeah. I think it's all our diversity, and with the very big tent that at least some people perceive we already have, we're still inside the confession of faith, aren't we? I mean, the confession of faith, we've, at least as a Board of Faith and Life, viewed it as that's the measuring stick. You know, is teaching still consistent with what our confession of faith says? And if it's not, then we have an issue that has to be addressed. So we're pretty diverse, but are we outside it? Yeah, Aaron.
Yeah. Well, one question as we think through, you know, how broad is our tent? Is there any denomination that truly has a more narrow tent than we do? If you look at almost any denomination of a certain size, they might have their confession, but there's going to be a broad tent within them as well, I would think. I don't know if that's a particularly Mennonite brethren concern. I guess that's one of the questions I have. Is this concern of how broad our tent is that particular to us, or is that just something everybody's going through?
In one of my
I don't know the answer. Yeah.
One of my classes, I start the course by telling a little bit about my journey through different churches, and then I invite them to do the same. And it's very, very typical for students to say, well, I grew up Catholic, and then I was converted in a Foursquare church, and then I joined a Baptist church when I was a young adult, and now I'm in a Presbyterian church. You know, who knows what, you know, probably 4 is the average number of denominations that people have gone through in their Christian journey. Well, the inevitable result of that is that there's a massive mixing in all denominations, because people are coming and going depending on where they're located, or where their children go to Sunday school, or where they find friends, or where they meet the Lord, or whatever factors. So my brethren are going to have among our membership people who have every imaginable church background, and so will every other church. And it's not that individual people are always changing their minds about what they believe, but the consensus in the church is now going to have to be built in the context where people come from every imaginable background. So I think you're spot on that most denominations would have exactly the same phenomenon within them. Those that much more carefully control who gets hired will have a particular way of dealing with that diversity by the hiring process or the ordination process. And we do too, to some extent. I mean, we have licensing questionnaires and things like that are used in part to say, well, what do we actually believe? some denominations are much more controlling of who can or can't become hired.
Tim, there are a couple of comments from FBC. I don't know if we've addressed those. That might be for next week.
Okay, yeah, a very good question by Greg Baxter. Some people have the grid of dispensationalism to read the texts. Others have the grid of covenant or reformed theology. Does Anabaptism have a grid? Yeah, it's probably more next week, but the short answer would be Anabaptism tends to be a little less likely to pick a systematic theological grid, and both of those are clearly that. Dispensationalism is a particular system that's been constructed to make the best sense from some people's point of view of how all the parts fit together, and Neo-Calvinism is another grid that's been constructed to answer the question in another way on some points, whereas Anabaptism has tended away from that. It's tended towards what I call a biblical theology approach. Of course, that needs lots of nuancing, but also in focusing on other questions. We don't have one right view of this question and one right view of that question or one right view of that question. We focus on what does it mean to follow Jesus. And so there's a tendency away from explicitly clear, theologically formulated systems of thought towards other sets of priorities. It doesn't mean there aren't typical ways that Anabaptists answer these questions, though. But again, more of that next week.
Okay, thank you so much. I think some of you would stay all day if we kept the conversation going, but I think Tim has work to do, maybe. And again, thank you all for participating. And don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you've got other things you'd like to talk about. Thank you so much. See you next week.
Bye.
Keep it shut.